Tonight, fighting terrorism.
I have presented to the House today legislative measures that seek to strengthen our national security.
Ottawa unveils its plan. It is sweeping, it's controversial, and it will affect the lives of all Canadians. Anthrax.
I just talked to Leader Daschle. His office received a letter, and it had anthrax in it.
As a top U.S. politician is hit, a question: what kind of people could be behind this? And nation building.
It's imperative that we at least establish some kind of structure in Afghanistan.
And I'm not sure the Americans are very good, frankly, at nation building.
What exactly is the desired result in Afghanistan? What should it be? A feature report from Brian Stewart.
The National. From the Canadian Broadcasting Centre, here is Peter Mansbridge.
Good evening. The federal government took some big steps to tackle terrorism today. It introduced controversial new legislation giving it sweeping new powers. The Justice Minister says the proposed omnibus bill would give a new sense of security to a nervous nation. But critics say it comes too late and goes too far. The anti-terrorism bill is our top story tonight. But first, a quick look at the day's other developments. Anthrax arrives in Washington in a letter to the U.S. Senate Majority Leader. Day 9 of the airstrikes on Afghanistan brings the most intense daylight bombing runs yet. The Pentagon dismisses Taliban claims that hundreds of Afghan civilians have been killed. And more protests erupt in Pakistan as the U.S. Secretary of State tries to defuse tensions between Pakistan and India. We begin in Ottawa with the new far-ranging anti-terrorism bill. The proposal adds new laws, rewrites old ones, all in a bid to fight terrorism and its supporters. Our chief political correspondent, Jason Moskowitz, has been covering this story on Parliament Hill. Jason.
Peter, Anne McClellan, the Justice Minister, says if Canadians are living in fear, then they are no longer living in a free and democratic society.
An act to amend the criminal code.
The bill defines acts of terrorism domestically as acts which threaten Canada's political institutions, the stability of the economy, and the general welfare of the country. To fight terrorism, the criminal code will be amended to create preventive arrests. Police will have the power to arrest someone they suspect is about to commit an act of terrorism. New offenses added to the criminal code include a maximum 10-year sentence for anyone who knowingly collects or provides funds directly or indirectly to carry out a terrorist act. A new maximum 10 years in prison for anyone taking part in the activities of a terrorist group by, for example, recruiting new members. 10 years for harboring or concealing a terrorist, and a life sentence for anyone who instructs someone to carry out a terrorist act.
Protect the
The Minister of Justice says she is confident once law, the new provisions will be judged consistent with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
We believe in a free and democratic society. The measures you see before us are justified to deal with the scourge of terrorism. We are very comfortable going into any court in this country and justifying everything you see in this legislation.
On electronic surveillance, authorization for wiretaps on suspected terrorists will be extended from 60 days to 1 year, and authorities will no longer have to demonstrate that a wiretap is a last resort.
Some areas.
Opposition parties agree in principle with the government. Like Stockwell Day, they have some suggestions.
We still don't clearly see the ability to detain and deport people who are identified as possibly dangerous.
From the NDP, a warning.
We will be putting it very much through the sieve of measuring whether the issue of freedom to engage in political protest that is reasonable and peaceful is protected, because this becomes particularly important at a time like this.
Joe Clark says the bill can't be compared to the second thoughts about the War Measures Act invoked at the time of the October crisis 31 years ago.
We're dealing with people who do not respect the rules most people respect, and we can't ignore them, because if we ignore them, there is no telling what their next attack might be.
No one's expecting a big fight over this in Parliament. The government hopes it will be law by Christmas. Peter?
Thanks, Jason. Jason Moskowitz in Ottawa. So the federal government says it needs this new law to fight terrorism. The opposition agrees. But does Ottawa really need quite that much legal firepower? Could this new law be used to curtail some basic human rights? Leslie McKinnon joins us with that story. Leslie.
Peter, there seems to be a feeling that these are extraordinary times that require extraordinary measures, but some critics are concerned about individual Canadians' rights and privacy.
The government is steadfast in its
As she introduced the anti-terrorism bill in the House, Justice Minister Anne McClellan described the Charter of Rights as an important Canadian value. But do dire times demand that police have more powers?
Does that require measures such as perhaps we have not seen or used in our criminal law before? Yes, and preventive arrest would be probably the best example.
Preventive arrest means arresting someone without a warrant, just on the suspicion that he or she is about to commit a terrorist act.
We've had situations in Canada where innocent people have been convicted of crimes and spent many years in prison.
In fact, he says, Canada already has laws on the books designed to prevent terrorism.
Under the Immigration Act, the Solicitor General and the Minister of Immigration can arrest a suspected terrorist and hold an in-camera process before a federal court judge.
Once the law is passed, police could arrest any citizen they think is on the brink of carrying out terrorism. Or they could haul someone in for an investigative hearing to be forced to answer questions before a judge.
It really suggests that someone doesn't have the right to remain silent. Now, maybe it's justified under the emergency, but, do we really want to have this as a permanent feature?
There's another net Canadians could get caught in. In the bill, a terrorist is defined as someone who disrupts an essential service for religious or political reasons. But this could ensnare illegal strikers or First Nations blockading a highway.
There may be an unintended overshooting of the target here, in the sense that you could, under the current definition, it seems you could disrupt an important public activity illegally and then automatically be a terrorist.
The bill is meant to protect Canadians, yet there's a curious lapse. There's nothing to force people to give up encryption codes, widely used now to garble phone and internet messages, and readily available.
It doesn't do all that much good to wiretap a phone if technology is being used so that you can't break the code.
Other measures.
The bill is complex and wide-sweeping. The question is, will it change the lives and restrict the rights of ordinary Canadians, or will it, as many fear, be directed at Arab and Muslim minorities?
I think that's why they also put in these hate propaganda provisions as well, to try to, sort of right that balance. But it is a worrying aspect.
As to whether this bill is essential to fight terrorism, most say yes, it is. As one person pointed out, on September the 11th, what we thought was a sophisticated law agency in the United States had no knowledge, virtually no knowledge, of the worst act of terrorism perpetrated on U.S. territory. Peter?
All right, Leslie, thanks very much. Leslie McKinnon here in Toronto tonight. Well, the House of Commons sat this evening for another important piece of war business, debate on the war itself and Canada's military contribution to it. Christina Lawand has been following that story. Christina.
Peter, Jean Chrétien promised Parliament would get a chance to debate Canada's participation in the U.S.-led coalition. Now it's getting that chance after the fact.
As the Governor-General's visit to the Halifax Naval Base makes perfectly clear, Canada's commitment is well underway.
You have been properly and well trained for your work. I have every confidence as your Commander-in-Chief that you are prepared for your task.
Wednesday, 3 vessels and more than 1,000 sailors will leave Halifax Harbor and join the U.S. campaign overseas. It's called Operation Apollo, the largest deployment of Canadian forces since the Korean War. And while details of the sailors' mission are not yet entirely clear, the Prime Minister told the House of Commons his reason for sending them.
To stand up for our people, for our values, for our way of life. To send a clear message to the cowards in the shadows who planned this crime against humanity.
From the opposition leader, no opposition. Stockwell Day says Canada's military participation is not something to be questioned.
Speaker, we recognize that there is probably no more difficult decision for a prime minister or a government to make than to send their own citizens into possible harm's way. That was a difficult choice, but the prime minister made the right decision.
The urgent task now is to catch and stop the criminals.
Earlier in the day, Joe Clark presented a motion offering unequivocal support for Canada's troops in their mission, asking the government only to give Parliament more frequent and regular briefings.
What is at issue here is not a matter of national security. It is about the practical value of facts, the advantage of information in helping to mobilize and to reassure a free society.
Monsieur Chrétien.
The Prime Minister agreed, voting in favor of Clark's motion. So did every party in the House, except for one.
Mr. Proctor. Mr. Proctor. Ms. Davies.
The NDP is the lone voice of dissent in this debate. The leader still arguing for a peaceful, UN-led solution.
To give any nation or any coalition of countries, no matter how broad, the right to act as judge, jury, and executioner when you're dealing with horrendous crimes is simply not acceptable.
The question remains, where does it all lead? Will Canada follow the U.S. if it decides to broaden its military campaign and target Iraq? The Prime Minister calls such talk hypothetical. Peter?
Thanks, Christina. Christine Lawand in the nation's capital tonight. Still ahead tonight, nation building.
You simply can't provide some kind of quick Kleenex pop-up system of government.
After the Taliban, what next for Afghanistan? And defining terrorist activity. Alison Smith examines exactly how Ottawa is doing it and what it means for Canadians. Anxiety over anthrax turned into full-blown paranoia today as people around the world reported mysterious envelopes and suspicious powders. Most tests came back negative, but as the CBC's David Holton reports, one positive result brought the anthrax crisis home to the U.S. government.
They were scenes never before witnessed on Capitol Hill. Doctors rushing to treat potential anthrax victims, offices quarantined, and special agents sent in to search them. It was at 10:30 this morning that a letter sent to Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle was opened by one of his 40 staff members. Powder spilled out.
Well, first of all, I'm concerned deeply for my staff, and I feel so badly for each of them.
Inside Daschle's office, the letter was tested on the spot and found to be positive for the anthrax bacteria. Staff members were treated with antibiotics.
They have been swabbed, and they will be tested now to see if they indeed do have any of the spores.
Public tours of Congress were canceled indefinitely. Visitors as upset as anyone by the anthrax scare in the heart of government.
I think that's really ugly. That's really awful.
Investigators are reported to have established an immediate link with another contaminated letter sent to NBC last week, both postmarked Trenton, New Jersey. And two mail workers in a New Jersey sorting station say they're suffering from what could be anthrax symptoms. For the first time, President George Bush said the poison letters could be the work of the Osama bin Laden network.
There may be some possible link. We have no hard data yet, but it's clear that Mr. bin Laden is a man who's an evil man.
At the Pentagon, officials were grappling with a different problem. More claims from the Taliban that those U.S. videos showing bullseye hits on military targets don't tell the whole story. The Taliban is accusing the U.S. of killing 200 civilians and injuring many others when it bombed the village of Karam last week.
The Taliban leadership and al-Qaeda are accomplished liars, that they go on television and they say things that we know are absolutely not true.
Rumsfeld also announced that along with those humanitarian food drops for hungry Afghans, the U.S. is now adding leaflets. One of them shows a Western soldier shaking hands with an Afghan and promising help for his country. On the home front, though, it's still those anthrax scares and worries about new terrorist attacks that are preoccupying Americans. 2 new cases were reported tonight. The child of an ABC News employee tested positive for skin anthrax, and a second employee of that supermarket tabloid in Florida was diagnosed with the more dangerous inhaled form of the disease. David Halton, CBC News, Washington.
Now, it's worth pointing out that there have been no confirmed cases of anthrax in Canada, but the fear is here, and today it reached all the way up to Parliament Hill. But as Kelly Crow reports, the anxiety over anthrax could do more damage than the disease itself.
An anthrax scare on Parliament Hill. Late this afternoon, emergency crews rushed to the government buildings. Several offices are evacuated. All of this because of a letter.
There was an employee here at the House of Commons who broke out in a rash, apparently as a result of opening a package, an envelope.
Initial tests show the powder is not anthrax. Experts say anthrax doesn't work fast enough to cause an immediate rash. However, the fear of anthrax in the mail has become an epidemic, even though it's one of the least effective ways to spread the disease.
As a mode of dispersing anthrax, it's very difficult.
Anthrax on the skin is easy to treat, so to be deadly, anthrax must be inhaled, lots of it, small enough to get into the lungs. Officials still don't know how this Florida man was exposed to a fatal dose, but experts say it's a feat difficult to achieve with a letter because anthrax spores naturally clump together, becoming too big to inhale. It's even less effective mixed with a powder because it will cling to that.
We've seen it contaminate the environment. We've seen other people have it on their skin or in their nose, but not causing disease.
Anthrax spores naturally try to fall to the ground because that's where they live, in the soil. All across Canada, anthrax bacteria lurks in the ground, waiting for animals to breathe it in. There are infections every year. Last year, anthrax killed more than 100 buffalo, 60 cattle. Still, Canada has never had a single human case of anthrax inhalation.
People need to know that this is a bug that we've been dealing with for many, many years, and it has not become a major health threat.
Scientists say anthrax could be extracted from a diseased animal or from the soil if someone knew how to do it and where to look. It's also common in many research labs, and until the rules were tightened, it could be ordered through the mail, and it's easy to grow.
I think if you had a BSc in microbiology, it wouldn't be an issue at all to grow it.
The tricky part is harvesting the spores and getting them into the air so they can hurt someone.
Delivering it is quite difficult in quantity because you have to arrange for people to get maybe 5,000 or 10,000 spores inhaled, and that may not be easy.
So far, one person has died. Shocking, frightening, but also oddly reassuring, the experts say, because it shows this is not a weapon of mass destruction. It's more effective as a weapon of fear. Kelly Crow, CBC News, Toronto.
Turning to the situation overseas now, beginning with the latest diplomatic moves. U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell is in Pakistan, arriving today as a national strike failed to get off the ground. Washington has dubbed Powell's trip to the region a listening tour. And as Patrick Brown reports, there's no shortage of voices to be heard.
Demonstrators were out on the streets, sending their message loud and clear. In Karachi, anti-American slogans were punctuated with rocks and tear gas. The national strike shut down several cities along the Afghan border. But elsewhere, many shops were open. Drugstore owner Asif Puri says only extremists oppose Pakistan's agreement to help the United States war on terrorism.
We don't want strike because I like government policies.
Many store owners hope helping the United States will bring economic benefits.
We know that American people want to help Pakistan.
But there's a widespread feeling here Osama bin Laden's guilt has not yet been proven.
Osama, I think he's a great man. He's a great conqueror, great freedom fighter.
Despite some violence, the protest movement has been small by Pakistani standards. After more than 4 weeks of demonstrations, fears for the stability of Pakistan seem to have receded for now. The government's main worry is what will follow the Taliban in Afghanistan. Abdul Haq made his name as a guerrilla commander in the war against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s. He says the Northern Alliance alone can't replace the Taliban. He's trying to build a resistance force of all ethnic and political groups. His message to the United States: support us.
My objective is to bring peace and security to my country, to solve our problem, because this future strong government can give a guarantee for the peace for Afghans and also for the people in the world.
And Pakistan has a message too. The United States should take its long quarrel with India into account.
So they should try to understand the geopolitical situation here, that whatever government is formed in Kabul should be friendly to Pakistan. India should have no role to play in the formation of a government in Kabul.
Powell may be visiting Pakistan and India to listen, but he also has to try to find a consensus between two nuclear powers which have already fought 3 wars in the past 50 years. Patrick Brown, CBC News, Islamabad.
Building consensus, however, will not be easy if today is any indication. Indian and Pakistani troops traded heavy fire across the line dividing Kashmir. It was the worst fighting in months. Both countries claim Kashmir as their own. Now, anger at the Americans wasn't confined to Pakistan today. Protesters in Indonesia were also on the streets to show their outrage, but so were riot police. A showdown emerged between the two sides, and it quickly got out of hand. The protesters want the government to condemn the airstrikes in Afghanistan. There have been daily demonstrations since the war began. Indonesia has the largest population of any Muslim country in the world. It's home to more than 228 million people. Along the front lines in Afghanistan, rebels with the Northern Alliance received the promise they've been waiting for. The Pentagon said today it will soon unleash a wave of bombs against Taliban positions north of the capital, Kabul. Michelle Cormier is in that region tonight.
It was another day of waiting, not of fighting, for these soldiers of the Northern Alliance. Silent guns, but a constant vigil for the Taliban enemy, waiting in the hills across the river. The commander of this artillery division, Lieutenant General Gemma Khan, says he's ready for the attack. He says he's got brand new ammunition from Russia, not just old shells from the war against the Soviets. And he says he's ready to tell the American military where the Taliban positions are. If the Americans strike with their cruise missiles, he says, that will really help us. Yet he is still waiting for the Americans and for the order to attack. If the Northern Alliance still hasn't launched the major offensive it's been promising for here, it's partly because the U.S. still hasn't bombed Taliban positions close to here. But it may also indicate a change of strategy. The Foreign Affairs Minister for the Afghan government in exile now says the Northern Alliance will not attack the capital, Kabul, anytime soon.
Perhaps that could mean moving to the outskirts of Kabul, just in the surrounding of Kabul, and waiting there.
For the Northern Alliance, a military victory without a political solution could be unmanageable. Northern Alliance leaders, under pressure from the United States, are on a diplomatic offensive to try to form a political coalition that would include all the ethnic groups of Afghanistan. The Northern Alliance claimed today it has made progress towards Mazar-e-Sharif, a strategic city long held by the Taliban. There are also reports Northern Alliance generals are buying off Taliban commanders with US dollars. The alliance hopes that whole regions will eventually switch sides, creating momentum for a victory and paving the way for a political settlement. But for the soldiers on the front line, politics will come much later. Every day they do drills, preparing for the attack, rehearsing for the main event. Michel Cormier, CBC News, Northern Afghanistan.
Another high-profile visitor in New York City today, one who came with a special honor for the mayor. Prince Andrew joined Rudolph Giuliani at Ground Zero. Earlier, the prince announced that Giuliani would be made an honorary knight. It's for his help and support to the families of the 200 Britons killed or missing in the destruction of the World Trade Center. Giuliani can't call himself Sir Rudy, but he can add the initials KBE after his name. Raise it, convert it, find ingenious ways of hiding it, better known as money laundering. Since September the 11th, there's been a global effort to starve terror groups of their funds. But following the money trail is tough. Today in Montreal, a conference on money laundering heard just how tough it is. Lynn Robson reports.
Money. It starts out clean, but every year more than $1 trillion is laundered by drug lords, organized crime, and terrorists.
Money can be as lethal as a bullet.
Police forces from 45 countries are meeting in Montreal now, debating how to separate terrorists from their money. Not an easy task, says Guylaine Leclerc.
It's more easy to launder money than it's easy to prove that they have laundered money.
A couple of examples of money laundering. Casino. A criminal goes in with thousands of dollars of cash, buys gambling chips, plays a game or two, then exchanges the chips for a check drawn on a legal company, the casino. The dirty money is now clean. Another example, a ski hill in Quebec, bought and paid for with drug money from Florida. Police had to catch the drug dealers to uncover the laundering scheme. In Canada, police estimate between $5 and $17 billion are laundered each year. They recover about $160 million.
You have to understand, this place was a terrible sink. As few as 5 years ago, there was an awful lot of money coming up here being laundered. Canada has made a huge step forward.
Huge steps, including new legislation and new financial support for fighting terrorism in all forms.
And we've had tremendous success with the legislation we have, and we expect to have much more success in the future.
The next challenge, say police, is to get other Canadians speaking out when business deals seem suspicious.
We've seen files where, for example, a helicopter was purchased, and the money that came to buy this helicopter came from about 30 different accounts. Now, the manufacturer is satisfied. They've been paid for their product, and they're not questioning the source of those funds.
That kind of blind eye attitude is typical. Police say for a long time Canadians believed money laundering was a non-violent crime of accounting. Now police ask, does anyone still believe that? Lynn Robson, CBC News, Montreal.
There are reports tonight that Ontario Premier Mike Harris is about to resign. The CBC's Raj Ahluwalia has talked to a source close to Harris. That source has told Raj that the Premier has been considering resigning for personal reasons, and an announcement could come as early as tomorrow. Mike Harris has been the Premier of Ontario since 1995. A big change in the prices at the pumps in Newfoundland. Starting today, they'll be controlled by the provincial government. Maximum prices will be set for gas, diesel, and propane to protect consumers. In the St. John's area today, that meant regular unleaded gas at a self-serve pump could cost no more than 75.3 cents a litre. Newfoundland is the third province to take aim at oil companies. Prince Edward Island and Quebec also have some form of price regulation. In Vancouver, police have expanded their investigation into a disturbing case. It focuses on the disappearance of dozens of women from the city's downtown east side over a period of about 20 years. Darryl McIntyre reports.
Ernie Cray doesn't have much to remember his sister Dawn by, other than a few old photos. As kids, they, along with 7 other brothers and sisters, were taken from their mother and farmed out to foster homes throughout BC. Cray heard little about his little sister until a year ago, when she became one of the latest women to join a list of missing women in a case that's baffled Vancouver police for years.
I was concerned last year at about this time that the investigative efforts of the Vancouver City Police had collapsed, that there wasn't any serious commitment to a continued investigation.
For years, family members have accused police of not taking the disappearances seriously enough because the missing women were almost all involved in prostitution and the drug trade on Vancouver's gritty east side. But last weekend, police summoned dozens of those family members to this hotel and told them the investigation is about to take on new energy.
As I understand it, this was the first time they met with this many families at one time, with the view in mind of bringing us up to date on the investigation.
Ernie Cray says families were told police are taking a new approach and putting more resources into the case.
So when they told us those things, I personally left the meeting more comfortable, perhaps convinced for this time that these folks are serious about this investigation.
RCMP officers confirmed they are about to start looking into new angles in the investigation and going back over some old work. But they're warning people not to get their hopes up too much.
This is a long-term project. It'll take quite some time to review all the files.
In fact, police admit they are no closer today to finding out what happened to the missing women. But families who attended this weekend's meeting say for the first time ever, they're optimistic they may eventually get some answers. Daryl McIntyre, CBC News, Vancouver.
Well, back to the war now. It began nearly 5 weeks ago with that devastating attack on U.S. soil. Since then, U.S. forces have turned their might on Taliban forces in Afghanistan. But where are we? Is anyone winning? The ones dropping the bombs, or if they're linked, the ones behind the fear which now grips much of North America. That's what we're going to talk about now. Joining us from Toronto, Janice Stein is an expert in international relations, and Wesley Wark specializes in national security and intelligence. Well, for weeks now, the political leaders on the coalition side have been saying that if the public is consumed by fear, then the other side is winning. I don't know about you, but it seems that much of the public is in fact consumed by fear right now. Initially it was about flying, now it's about anthrax. Wesley Wark, is the climate of fear saying right now that the other side is winning?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the level of fear is at a supportable level at this stage. The problem is really that we don't know where we are with this war. We don't know what kind of a war it is. We don't know where it's going to go. We don't know the stages of it. We don't have a story for it. And we've grown to expect, I'm afraid, that wars are going to follow certain easily recountable kinds of histories. We saw this in the Gulf War. We saw this in the war in Kosovo. And now we're in a very unfamiliar kind of war. And I suppose we don't have a sense yet of the enemy, the nature of the enemy, or how it's going to be defeated, and we're being taken constantly by surprise by revelations about the dimensions of the terrorist attack of September 11th and the aftermath assaults, now including Anthrax. So
what do you mean by an acceptable level of fear?
Well, I think that certainly in this country, and it seems even across the border in the United States, that people understand or are beginning to understand that we are in fact now at war. We're not very familiar with this concept in our generation in North America, but we understand that in some sense the continent is under attack. The attack is taking new kinds of forms, and so we're trying to get used to that idea and used to both the visual images and ways of thinking about that kind of war. But the greatest difficulty, I think, in coping with the war is understanding what can come next, and I think that this is where we really face enormous difficulties. We just don't have a clear sense, and there's no way that governments can reassure us about what can happen next.
Janice, what's your thought on this?
Peter, I think that there certainly is a very high level of fear in the public, and that's precisely what terrorist actions of all kinds really are designed to do. They're designed to terrorize the population. But that fear, I think, is as much a product of shock as of the unfolding of events in the last 5 weeks. The anthrax scare has in fact been contained. It's very difficult to use anthrax as a weapon against large numbers of people. It's very ineffective. And
but it may be ineffective. I'm surprised, though, that you're saying the scare has been contained, because it seems each day, in fact, that the fear factor on anthrax, no matter about the facts, which everybody's trying to lay before the public, seems to just be increasing on a daily basis. And surely this is not the climate that the governments on the coalition side had hoped their publics would be involved in at a time like this.
No, I think you're right, that the fear is far higher than political leaders would like. I think it's a question really of how we think about this, Peter. Anthrax, for instance, is less of a public health hazard than the flu epidemic that will undoubtedly come this winter. We are better positioned now in North America than we were 5 weeks ago to handle the kinds of things that are likely to unfold. I think the point really is, are we concentrating on the cup that's half full or half empty? The public is still concentrating on the cup that's half empty.
So you're suggesting then that we're safer now than we were 5 weeks ago?
Oh, there's no question about it. The kinds of incidents that happened at the airports in Logan simply would not happen that way again, Peter. They're generally a more vigilant population. Even the way people are treating the mail. You know, anthrax is only truly dangerous if you inhale it. I can't imagine anybody is going to inhale anything that comes in a letter. Much more knowledgeable public and improvement in security. Not where we need to be entirely, but getting better.
Wesley, would you agree with that? We're safer now than we were 5 weeks ago?
No, I don't think I would agree, but I would couch it in different terms. I don't think we can feel safer now than we did in the past because, again, we don't know what to expect next. And I think our sense is that the governments and the coalition powers themselves cannot predict what's going to happen next. So we don't know what form this war is going to take. We don't have a sense of the shape of victory yet overseas. We don't have a sense of the possibility of further terrorist attacks. But to come back to your original point, Peter, I would say that I think one of the problems that governments had in trying to, if you like, mobilize public opinion in support of this war on terrorism, a new kind of war, was a concern that, in fact, publics would not understand this war and would not support it, either in the short term or the long term. And when I said acceptable level of fear before, I think what we're seeing is a process that was itself unpredictable, that people are, in a sense, beginning to understand the situation they're in and prepared to understand that we're in a war and understand that the consequences are unpredictable. So to feel, in a sense, insecure in war is a normal condition, and better, in a sense, to be aware of war and its unpredictability, what Clausewitz called the fog of war, than to pretend, as happened, for example, in Europe during the phony war, that nothing had changed. So although fear is with us and fear is going to be with us, in some senses, I think this is a natural condition of war.
All right. We're going to leave it at that. We thank you both, Wesley Wark and
Peter.
Janice Stein, both here in Toronto tonight. Well, Afghanistan has been ravaged by war and long before bombs started dropping 9 days ago. It's a country by conflict, torn apart by conflict and poverty. Sometime, no one can say exactly when, the war against terrorism will be over and Afghanistan will be rebuilt. But who should do it and how is the subject of some debate. Here's the National senior correspondent, Brian Stewart.
When President George Bush ran for office, one of his strongest vows was no more nation building, no humanitarian quagmires like Haiti or Somalia.
I don't think our troops ought to be used for what's called nation building. I think our troops ought to be used to fight and win war. I think our troops ought to be used to help overthrow a dictator when it's in our best interests.
But Afghanistan is altering that worldview. Even conservative Republicans now concede making war is not enough. Once the Taliban falls, there's no simple walking away this time. For starters, $330 million has been earmarked for reconstruction. One voice of conservatives, Charles Krauthammer, political analyst and columnist.
There's a huge distinction between nation building in Somalia or in Haiti, which is not a strategic threat to the United States, and therefore is a kind of a strategic luxury, as opposed to nation building in Afghanistan, which is the hub and a heartland of terror. In one place, it's inappropriate to spend our resources on building a civil society, for example, in Somalia, where it's impossible. On the other hand, it's imperative that we at least establish some kind of structure in Afghanistan after the fall of the current regime that will be stable enough to prevent the return of bin Laden and his ilk to Afghanistan.
So the U.S. may be ready for nation building, but some of the coalition fear its military operations have run far ahead of political planning. There's little sign yet Afghan opposition groups, like those who've met with the 86-year-old former monarch, can forge a realistic union. For now, there's real danger of a deadly post-Taliban vacuum. Some believe the nation can only be rebuilt from the bottom up. Former Canadian Foreign Minister Lloyd Axworthy.
And I'm not sure the Americans are very good, frankly, at nation building. One of the things that I think has to be learned is that you simply can't provide some kind of quick Kleenex pop-up system of government that all of a sudden appears. You have to get some roots back in the country, and that's where there has to be a much stronger involvement of a lot of the agencies who have been working in Afghanistan, who have real feet on the ground, who know the system, have to be brought in as part of the solution. And right now I don't think we're doing that, and I think it's not good nation building that's going on right now.
Even if there are political agreements, the challenge is frightening in a war and drought-ravaged society that lacks virtually everything, where millions are in danger of starvation.
I think it has to be a UN operation. I think it has to require a lot of resources coming in from other countries. I mean, even Canada, with its experience in peace building, I think has a lot to offer here, but we have to be a part of the game and help shape that agenda.
Here, nation building is well beyond the power of any one country like the U.S. It will take tens of billions of dollars and perhaps a full generation with regional and world leadership.
I wouldn't only welcome it, I think we ought to insist on it. The role of building a nation in Afghanistan ought to be given to countries of goodwill, experience, like Canada, some of the European countries, some of the countries in the region, perhaps a few of the Muslim countries who are reasonably far away, like Turkey and Morocco and Tunisia, as a way to have the world involved in establishing a new and unrepressive regime in Afghanistan. But if we get bogged down as Americans in doing that, we're going to be distracted from our focus, which is to go after the heartland of terrorism where it emanates from. And it isn't only in Afghanistan, unfortunately.
The United Nations is even considering a temporary mandate as part of an historic reconstruction program, if and when peace comes. No one underestimates the difficulties ahead.
Well, Brian joins us in studio now. A UN mandate, what would that actually entail?
The UN diplomat today said they're dealing with a blank sheet of paper here. They have to basically build everything. They have to get the factions together talking. They got to give them a sense of security. They got to get neighboring countries on side. Then they have to build everything from the ground up, from electricity, farming, schools, education. There's nothing that they don't have to work at here. Everything has to break well. So obviously, above all, they have to get the factions talking, agreeing, and some sense of security and a future to Afghanistan.
When you look at Afghanistan's history, especially the last 20 years, you do start to wonder, though, whether anything can be possible.
It's terribly hard not to despair. One has to hang on to some examples like Cambodia being put back together, East Timor, Beirut looked like it would never settle down. It has. You always have to grab onto the few successes and hope that you can do the same elsewhere.
All right, Brian, thanks very much. Our senior correspondent, Brian Stewart. When we return, Alison Smith on what the new terrorism bill may mean for Canada in the future.
Closed captioning of this program is brought to you by Standard Life. Standard Life. Profit from our knowledge.
Introducing the revolutionary GMC Envoy. With more interior space than Jeep Grand Cherokee, better fuel efficiency, and more standard towing power than Ford Explorer, and more horsepower than any sport utility in its class. Perhaps most remarkable, though, is Envoy's price. For $39,998, you can drive one, well, anywhere.
Do you believe in fate?
I never thought about it. Will you get me your phone number?
It began as a game.
I'm going to write my name and my number inside this book and then sell it to a used bookstore.
That's just
crazy. It turned into a search. Maybe you have to make your fate happen, like when you get the right clues. How far would you go to find your true love? Just tell me your name. When you put it that way, no. Serendipity.
It's got to be here. I can feel it. Ow!
Now playing at theaters everywhere.
With Weight Watchers, every food has a points value. And now every point works harder than ever. Introducing Winning Points, the way to stay satisfied, eat what you like, and still stay within your daily points range. Winning Points helps you get the most mileage out of what you eat, so you stick with it and lose weight.
Join Weight Watchers now for only $37. Save $8.
We all have our winning points. Let Weight Watchers show you yours.
Now be careful. You're going to be on your own for 6 months.
Make sure you fool him. You've got my son.
I got it. You'll be fine.
This is the 540 call for flight 540 and gate number 7.
Bye.
Whether you're 25, 45, or older, you can start planning your future right now.
Forget this.
Yeah, kind of hard to backpack around Europe without this.
Have fun. Okay, bye.
Freedom 55 Financial. The freedom to choose, the power to get there.
Tuesday on CBC Television. Being touched makes babies thrive, and the sense of touch enables them to explore the world and avoid injury. Touch, the Forgotten Sense, on the nature of things at 8. Then at 9, trace the ancient roots of contemporary magic with Penn & Teller's Magic and Mystery Tour.
It is typical Indian magic.
Penn & Teller visit India, Tuesday starting at 8, with The Nature of Things on CBC Television.
Who is a terrorist? What is terrorism? You'd think the answers would be simple enough, especially after September 11th. But the federal government's efforts to put those definitions into its anti-terrorism bill are raising warnings from some that the task is not as simple as it sounds. Alison Smith now with a special report on defining terror.
The violent protests surrounding last April's Summit of the Americas in Quebec City were called many things at the time. Hooliganism by some, a legitimate protest against globalization by others. One word not tossed about was terrorism. Maud Barlow was a protester.
I do believe that the protesters in Quebec City and other places in Canada and around the world could be caught in this kind of a language. I'm not suggesting it was intended for that, but the language is too sweeping, the definitions are too broad.
The government has said it has crafted the definition to avoid targeting legal protests. But a reading of the definition, say critics, leaves it open to abuse. Specifically, the proposal says terrorist activity is an action that is taken or threatened for political, religious, or ideological purposes and threatens the public or national security by killing, seriously harming, or endangering a person, causing substantial property damage that is likely to seriously harm people, or by interfering with or disrupting an essential service, facility, or system.
I actually fear that they'll try to put democracy to sleep and in doing so end up with a nightmare worse than we have had. I mean, the legislation, we need all the laws that are, or measures that are necessary, but not necessarily all these measures. They go too far.
The changes to the criminal code, say critics, could also have an impact on groups like Greenpeace, who often use tactics like interference and disruption of services to make their point. While it's true they and the protesters in Quebec City, for that matter, have faced criminal charges, they tend to be for offenses like mischief and obstruction.
This is a War Measures Act. It is, the War Measures Act wrote bigger and better and with more bang for your buck than it ever had.
Clayton Ruby is a lawyer and civil rights advocate.
It will wind up being used against peaceful protests and demonstrations. It will wind up to be used to suppress political opposition. That's the problem with these things. They come in as emergencies, as temporary measures. Only for a short time, we assure you, we all agree how important this is. But they're never temporary. They're always permanent. You never roll it back.
I think the government is signaling that there's a political will in Canada to counter terrorism.
Many, though, say the government is taking the right step. Martin Rudner is the president of the Canadian Association for Security and Intelligence Studies. He says the simple fact is organizations like CSIS don't have the resources to investigate anti-globalization protesters.
These are organizations which are, in fact, short of staff. Their numbers of personnel have been diminished over the past 10 years. We know that they have a scarcity of an ability to do analysis, to do translations. They're not interested in people who have a view on trade policy or on investment policy or on globalization. To the extent that those views are legitimate as far as these organizations are concerned, let them ring out.
The next step in the government's plan to define terrorism is to come up with a list of groups it considers to be involved in terrorism. And if there are concerns being raised now about Canada's new definition, they'll almost certainly get louder when the government actually begins to name names. Britain's new terrorism law, for example, has roughly the same definition as Canada's, but Britain has already drawn up its list. For instance, Britain has included the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, which operates against Turkey, a NATO ally. It does not list other Kurdish groups that operate against Iraq. But Martin Rudner says it's the experience in other countries like Britain which should calm any fears Canadians have about the new proposals.
In fact, the British, as we all know, not only have a challenge before them from international terrorism, they also have had a Northern Irish terrorist challenge before them, and still, despite bomb explosions in the United Kingdom, the law has not been abused, and there have not been complaints about the abuse of the law.
Well, we know something about this listing process, because the Americans did it through the 50s and 60s, the communists and all their front groups. And what we know is it caused a great amount of human pain, but it didn't do anything to stop the spread of communism. The real world responded to real events, not to these lists. This is ineffective. It violates our civil rights, and I'd be prepared to look at it and consider it seriously if I thought for a minute I'd be safer, but I tell you, it's not going to make you or I one whit safer.
Still, safety and security are what the Canadian government hopes to achieve with this legislation. It's also part of what Canada sees as its contribution, along with its military commitment, to the global campaign against terrorism. For The National, I'm Alison Smith.
And we'll be back after this break with some of your thoughts.
Closed captioning provided by members of the Canadian Real Estate Association. You've got a life. We let you live it. We're realtors. Real estate is our life.
I haven't made a huge fortune in this business, but it's my fortune. Some of it is going to Zach's tuition. So I checked where I bank. I found out my savings are protected, up to $60,000, by the Canada Deposit Insurance Corporation. I'm glad I did, because some things, like mutual funds and foreign currency accounts, aren't protected. So check, because if you don't ask, you'll never know.
They were cousins. They could never marry.
A Clarica agent can make sense of almost anything, especially your investments and insurance. Clarica.
So, genetics gave you one kind of hairstyle. Maybe you'd prefer another? Presenting Physique. Scientifically designed to give you 20 hours of the hairstyle you want. The Physique Volumizing Collection gives 20 hours of body and fullness. Or the Physique Straight Shape Collection gives 20 hours of smoothness. So, while genetics may be predetermined, your style is totally up to you. 20-hour volumizing and straight shape collections from Physique.
What's more exciting than a chance to win millions? The chance to also win a new car. From October 13th to October 27th, Lotto 649 is giving you 50 chances to win something big. An all-new BMW 3 Series sedan. So play your numbers now, because with Lotto 649, for once your ticket could get you a car instead of your car getting you a ticket. Play now for 50 chances to win an all-new BMW.
A star shine in a dazzling music charity event to aid the United Nations Donor Alert Appeal, featuring Alanis Morissette, Bruce Cockburn, The Tragically Hip, and the Bare Naked Ladies. Music Without Borders, Sunday night on CBC.
I'm Ian Hannamansing in Vancouver. Tomorrow on Canada Now, the latest on the war on terrorism and a special investigative report. Police in a small British Columbia town accused of brutality.
Some of the comments from you, our viewers. Now, lastly, before we go, here's a preview of a story we're planning to have tomorrow night.
I'm Sasha Petrusik in Ottawa. Once it was famous for helping the Allies bust Nazi secret codes. By September 11th, how Canada's spy status had slipped.
Canada, I think, really was a freeloader at that Allied table.
Its main spy agency cut back, its high-tech eavesdroppers under-equipped. Former spies say intelligence all but ignored on Parliament Hill.
For some people, they say, yeah, this stuff is not part of the Canada that I believe in and want to know about, so it doesn't exist.
Now what?
You don't get that capability from an employment agency. It has to be built up and trained, and the skills are ones that are learned.
Spy status, tomorrow night on The National.
That's The National for this Monday night. You can always get the latest news just by going to cbc.ca. I'm Peter Mansbridge. Thanks for watching.
The road to the Grey Cup is a tough one, and CBC Sports Saturday covers the action. The Montreal Alouettes go hit for hit with the Calgary Stampeders. The CFL on CBC, Saturday at 3 Eastern.